Tanya Whitfield, exhausted from a long business trip, boards her flight, seeking only peace. Little does she know, this routine journey will soon change everything. Tanya Whitfield had spent the entire day flying between meetings, giving presentations, and closing deals. The kind of day that left you physically drained and mentally fried. She longed for peace and quiet, a brief escape from the grind of corporate life. The moment her plane touched down in Dallas, she felt a rush of exhaustion. There was no time to enjoy the city's charm, no time to relax, just a whirlwind of work that required her presence. She hadn't even been able to enjoy a decent meal. But now, finally, as she was headed back to Atlanta, the only thing on her mind was getting on the plane, finding her seat, and zoning out. Her tired eyes darted to the board, scanning the gate number once more. She was flying coach on the way back, no luxury, no business class seat. It was a last-minute ticket, purchased when a meeting had gotten rescheduled. Group 4 was called, and Tanya stood up, adjusting the weight of her bag on her shoulder, and shuffled toward the gate. She had her routine. Check the ticket, board quietly, find her seat, and lose herself in whatever task would keep her from feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was always the same, a bubble of space between her and the rest of the passengers, where she could be anonymous. Walking down the narrow jet bridge toward the plane, Tanya's thoughts wandered. Would she have time for laundry this weekend? Grocery shopping? Maybe catch up on sleep? Small tasks she could control in a world that often felt like it was spiraling out of control. Boarding was slow. A middle-aged woman was arguing with the flight attendant at the door over an oversized carry-on, and a family with 3 noisy kids tried to find their seats. Tanya bypassed the scene, slipping past them, eager to settle in. When she entered the cabin, she looked for her row, 18C. She could already see the space, a little more private, a little less crowded than some of the other sections. She could sink into that seat, put on her headphones, and drift away into the world of emails, silence, or maybe a podcast to distract her mind. A sweet, 3-hour escape. She slid into her seat, wedging her bag under the chair in front of her. The aisle was busy. Passengers were settling in, placing their carry-ons in the overhead compartment, arguing over legroom and trying to get comfortable. Everything was perfectly mundane, until it wasn't. Tanya adjusted her seatbelt, checked her phone for the time, and glanced up just as the family she'd seen earlier came down the aisle. The man, tall with a buzz cut and a rugged look, looked like he'd just stepped off a golf course. His daughter, no more than 6 or 7, clutched a stuffed animal and fidgeted with her backpack. The man looked down at Tanya, then at her seat. "You're in our seat," he said flatly, as if the words had been rehearsed. Tanya blinked in confusion. "Sorry? That's 18 degrees Celsius, right?" He glanced at the ticket in his hand. Tanya looked at the ticket scanner, then back at him. "Yes, it is. But this is my seat. I'm sure there's some confusion, but—" He interrupted her before she could finish, his voice rising slightly. "Well, my daughter needs to sit here." He glanced down at the little girl who was clutching her stuffed animal a little tighter. "She doesn't do well sitting next to strangers like you." The words hit Tanya harder than she expected. She felt the weight of them in her chest, sharp, cold. It wasn't just the seat. It wasn't about his daughter's comfort. It was the subtle implication, the way he said it, the way his eyes met hers, and then quickly shifted away, as if she wasn't worth acknowledging. Tanya took a steadying breath. She could feel the familiar shift, the subtle tension that always hung in the air when she was in public spaces, especially with people like him. The ones who didn't think they had to explain themselves. The ones who thought their discomfort with people like her was a legitimate reason to push her around. The ones who assumed entitlement. She glanced at the empty seats in the back of the plane, then back at him. "There are seats further back," she said calmly, her voice steady. "Perhaps you can find one there for her. This one's mine." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," he said, his tone now flat, demanding. "She's sitting here. I paid for this seat, and I'm not asking you again." Tanya took a deep breath. There were so many ways she could respond, so many ways she could let the situation spiral. She could feel the familiar warmth rising in her chest, the anger that often simmered just under the surface when people thought they could bully her with their words and their privilege. But she had learned to control that, to rise above. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze. "This is my seat, and I'm not moving. I paid for it just as much as you did. If your daughter doesn't want to sit next to me, you'll have to find another way to deal with it. I'm not the problem here." A flash of red crossed the man's face, but before he could respond, the little girl shifted uncomfortably, her eyes wide. The atmosphere around them thickened. Tanya could feel the tension now, heavier than before. She could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, some watching, others pretending not to see. He glanced back at his daughter, his tone softening. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, turning to her. "We'll get another seat." Tanya wasn't done yet. She wasn't just going to let him off the hook for how he'd spoken to her. "You know," she said, keeping her voice level but with a bit more edge, "you're teaching your daughter that it's okay to make people feel uncomfortable simply because you don't like who they are or where they come from." He blinked, and for a moment, she thought maybe she'd struck a nerve. His lips tightened, and he looked around, realizing that passengers had begun to notice the interaction. There were no loud protests or accusations, no immediate outbursts from the surrounding passengers. But the room had shifted. The small murmur of the plane was now tense, awkward. Whispers floated between rows. The father stood still, his face reddening. But Tanya didn't break her gaze. She didn't flinch. The father took a slow step back, glancing at the little girl, who was still standing quietly next to him, clutching her stuffed animal. Tanya noticed the subtle way his hand rested on the girl's shoulder, protective, but perhaps a little too possessive. The girl's wide eyes flicked nervously between Tanya and her father, the tension clearly unsettling her. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air. Passengers were starting to glance around, some pretending not to pay attention, others clearly waiting to see how it would play out. Tanya's heart was pounding in her chest, but she stayed still. She wouldn't let him win this, not like this. "I'm not asking again," the man said, his voice louder now, with a sharp edge to it. "Move. My daughter needs to sit here." Tanya blinked, her calm beginning to crack just slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said evenly, but with a firm edge that carried more weight than before. His face flushed red now, and his hand clenched into a fist at his side, his knuckles turning white. He took a half step forward, leaning in a little too close, towering over her. Tanya could feel the heat from his body, the pressure of his words pushing against her, but she refused to back down. "I paid for this seat," he said again, the words almost like a mantra. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you." Tanya leaned back just slightly, holding his gaze. Her voice was steady but sharp as she responded, "You don't own the plane, and you don't own me. I'm not moving." The heat in his expression intensified. "What? You think you're better than everyone else? You think you're entitled to sit here just because of who you are?" His voice was rising now, echoing slightly down the aisles. Tanya's stomach turned at the implication, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat taller, her spine straight. I think I'm entitled to my seat because I bought it just like you bought yours. No one should have to move because they don't fit someone else's idea of who should belong." The cabin was growing quieter now. A few heads had turned, but everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what to do. Tanya could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her, but she didn't look away from the man. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her stumble, of seeing her back down. "You're making a scene," she continued, her tone a little sharper, a little more pointed. "Is this what you want your daughter to remember? That you made a scene because a black woman was sitting in a seat you thought she didn't deserve?" The man's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger now, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line. He looked at his daughter for a moment, his expression faltering as if he was suddenly aware of the little eyes watching him. But the look quickly vanished, replaced by a stubborn resolve. "I don't care what you think," he muttered, still trying to keep control of his voice, but the tremble in his words betrayed him. His posture was tense, as if waiting for Tanya to break, for her to give in, to apologize. But she didn't. Tanya's gaze never wavered. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but firm. "It's not about what I think. It's about what you think, and what you've shown your daughter here today." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the space between them. "You've shown her that when you don't like something, you demand it change. You've shown her that it's okay to make someone else uncomfortable just so you can feel good." The little girl shifted uncomfortably, glancing up at her father. Tanya caught the brief flicker of confusion in her eyes, a child's confusion at something that was supposed to make sense but didn't. For a moment, the father's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter, but the softness was quickly replaced by irritation. "You don't know what you're talking about." Tanya shook her head slightly, her voice never losing its calm composure. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Just as the situation seemed to be teetering on the edge, as if a single word could push it into chaos, the soft sound of footsteps interrupted the standoff. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was calm yet carried an undeniable authority. Tanya glanced toward the front of the cabin, and there, standing with her arms crossed, was a flight attendant. Her name tag read Marisol Vega. Marisol was in her 50s, with a kind but unwavering presence. Her eyes moved between the father, the little girl, and Tanya, scanning the situation in an instant, taking in everything: the frustration in the father's stance, the tension in Tanya's face, and the subtle signs of discomfort in the surrounding passengers. The father opened his mouth to speak, but Marisol was faster. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I understand you want your daughter to be comfortable, but this is the passenger's assigned seat." She nodded toward Tanya. "Is this your seat, ma'am?" Tanya didn't hesitate. She pulled out her boarding pass and held it up for Marisol to see. "Yes," she said simply. Marisol nodded in acknowledgement, her gaze now shifting back to the man. "Sir, you are welcome to find another seat for your daughter. However, this passenger has the right to her seat, and I cannot ask her to move." The father blinked, taken aback by the flight attendant's calm but firm authority. He opened his mouth to argue, but Marisol cut him off before he could speak. "I can help you find a different seat for your daughter, but I need to ask you to lower your voice and stop causing a disruption. We're not asking for an argument." There was a moment of hesitation, a brief, almost imperceptible falter in the father's demeanor, as he looked from Marisol to Tanya, then back to the other passengers, who had now stopped pretending not to notice. The pressure in the cabin was thick, but it was beginning to shift. The eyes that had once been on Tanya now shifted toward the man. And then, with a muttered, defeated curse, the father stepped back. "Fine," he said, turning away. "We'll find another seat." Marisol gave a small, imperceptible nod, her job done. She turned to Tanya. "Are you okay?" Tanya nodded, though she felt her muscles relax for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The tension in the cabin began to lift, and the whispers died down. As the father and daughter retreated to the back of the plane, Tanya allowed herself to exhale. The tension that had been building in her chest slowly loosened, like a heavy weight lifting off her shoulders. She sank deeper into her seat, pulling her bag into her lap and slipping her headphones on, though the noise around her still buzzed in the background. She was grateful for Marisol's intervention. The flight attendant had stepped in at just the right moment, speaking with authority but never raising her voice. It had diffused the situation without escalating things further, without letting the man drag them both into something far worse. Marisol had made sure that the other passengers knew who was in the right, without saying a word more than necessary. As the plane continued to taxi toward the runway, Tanya stared out the window, letting her thoughts drift. "You did the right thing," she told herself quietly. She'd stood her ground, refused to be bullied, but that didn't mean it was easy. The whole thing had left her shaken. There was always a weight when you had to deal with this kind of thing. The constant wondering whether you'd spoken up enough, whether you'd been too harsh, whether you'd made a scene. But this time, it had felt different. It had felt right. A voice over the intercom interrupted her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane began its ascent into the night sky. But even though she was physically leaving the ground, Tanya couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. The words of the father echoed in her mind. Why is it always people like her who get protected? Tanya thought about the assumption that had led him to think he could demand her seat. How easily he had assumed that her place in the world was less important than his discomfort, that someone like her didn't belong. Her hand tightened around the armrest, but she didn't let the anger build. Instead, she turned her attention to Marisol, who was walking down the aisle checking in on passengers. She smiled warmly at a few and offered a few soft words to others. Marisol had been the calm in the storm, a quiet force that had shifted the whole atmosphere. It wasn't her words that had done it. It was the way she had handled herself, without losing her composure, without backing down from what was right. Tanya watched her for a moment. The flight attendant's calm presence had made a difference. Tanya wasn't sure if it was just the flight attendant's professionalism that had stopped the situation from escalating, or if something else had shifted in the cabin. Maybe it was that the father had finally realized that no one was willing to back him up. Maybe it was the quiet, unwavering strength of a woman who refused to let injustice slide. A few minutes later, Marisol returned, walking down the aisle toward Tanya. She paused as she approached, looking down at Tanya. There was a softness in her eyes now, the edge of her professional demeanor fading as she offered a small, understanding smile. "You did well back there," Marisol said quietly, as if they were sharing a secret. Tanya returned the smile, but there was a twinge of something in her chest. "I wasn't sure I could keep it together," she admitted, her voice low. "I mean, he just pushed so hard, and for no reason. I don't understand why people think they can do that." Marisol nodded, looking at her with the kind of understanding only someone who had worked in customer service for years could possess. "It's a lot harder than people think," she said gently. "You handled it well. People like him, they don't think about the weight of their words. They don't understand how easy it is for someone to feel small in those moments." Tanya nodded slowly, grateful for the kind words. "Thank you." Marisol gave her a soft smile. "No problem. You're not alone in this, you know? Sometimes it's just about holding your ground and not letting them win." Tanya's gaze followed Marisol as she walked back toward the front of the plane. The weight of her words lingered in the air, like a small, comforting breath of fresh air. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin started to fade. The father and daughter, seated several rows back, were quiet now. The little girl, who had been so nervous earlier, was nestled against her father, holding her stuffed animal as she gazed out the window. He too seemed subdued, his earlier defiance softened by the quiet exchange that had just taken place. Tanya could feel the difference in the air now. It wasn't just the lack of confrontation, though that was a relief. It was something deeper, a sense of justice, the realization that, even in small, quiet moments, standing your ground could make a difference. And it wasn't just about the man at the front of the plane. It was about all the moments that had led to this one, all the times she had stayed silent when she knew she shouldn't have, all the times she had let things slide, thinking it wasn't worth it. This time, it was worth it. As the plane leveled off, the soft hum of the engines filled the space, a gentle reminder that they were on their way home. Tanya leaned back in her seat, her body relaxing just a little more with each passing minute. The tension from the earlier confrontation seemed to melt away, but there was still a lingering energy in the air, something unspoken, yet present. The flight attendant, Marisol, had been right about one thing. People like the father didn't always realize the weight their words carried. They didn't understand the subtle pressure they put on others, assuming that their discomfort was reason enough to make someone else feel small. Tanya thought about it for a while, feeling the sting of the man's words. People like her who get protected. That was what had stung the most. Not just the demand, not the discomfort he had caused her, but the fact that, in his eyes, she had been the one in the wrong. She'd been the one who didn't belong, but she had stood up for herself. For a second, she had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. The seatbelt sign dinged off, signaling they were cruising now, and the plane began to feel more settled. The flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks, snacks, and a quick, quiet interaction with each passenger. The normalcy of it all almost felt surreal after what had just happened. Tanya pulled her phone back out of her bag and glanced at her notifications. There was an email from her boss, another project to review when she got back, a text from her mother asking how the trip had gone, a few messages from friends checking in on her, as they always did after a busy work week. But as she looked down at her phone, something tugged at her attention, something she hadn't expected. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Miss Whitfield?" Tanya looked up in surprise to see the woman from across the aisle, the one who had watched the whole confrontation with quiet curiosity. She was standing now, hesitating as if unsure whether or not to intrude. The woman was dressed in a smart navy blazer, her hair neatly styled and her posture poised. She looked like someone who might have been traveling for work, maybe on her way to a meeting or an event. Tanya blinked, uncertain of the woman's intent. "Yes?" The woman hesitated, then smiled softly. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there, it was impressive." Tanya's eyebrows furrowed slightly. She hadn't expected anyone to come up to her, much less offer a compliment. The sudden attention made her a little uncomfortable, but there was something in the woman's expression that made her feel seen, in a way that felt oddly comforting. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman continued, clearly not wanting to overstep, "but I've been sitting here the whole time, and I just wanted to say, it took a lot of courage to stand your ground like that. I could see the way the whole cabin shifted after Marisol stepped in. But you kept it together, and I really admire that." Tanya blinked again, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to receiving compliments from strangers, especially not for something that felt so ordinary to her. But the warmth in the woman's voice made Tanya smile, even if it was small. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice still carrying a trace of the exhaustion she felt. I didn't want to back down. I just had to stand up for myself." The woman nodded, her smile growing a little more genuine. "Exactly," she said. That's the thing. We don't always realize how much those little moments matter, how they can shift the way people see things, how they see themselves. Tanya paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. There was something profound in what the woman said, something she hadn't considered fully. Standing her ground had felt like an immediate reaction to a frustrating situation. But it wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't just about the father. It was about a message. A message that, no matter what someone else tried to impose on her, she wasn't going to shrink. She wasn't going to fade into the background because of someone else's discomfort. She wasn't going to let them define her place in the world. "Thank you," Tanya said again, this time with a little more certainty in her voice. It's not always easy to speak up, but it felt right. The woman's eyes softened as she nodded. It was. And it's not just about what you did. It's about how you did it. You didn't let him win. And that's what matters. Tanya nodded, feeling a quiet sense of pride begin to take root in her chest. She hadn't realized it until now, but she hadn't just defended her seat. She had defended herself. She had shown herself, both to the man who had tried to push her down and to the people around her, that she mattered, that her space was hers to claim. And then, as quickly as the moment had started, the woman smiled one last time. "I just wanted to say that. It's not often people take a stand like that." With that, she gave Tanya a brief nod and returned to her seat, leaving Tanya with a feeling of quiet empowerment that lingered far longer than the words themselves. Tanya leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight of the day finally begin to settle in her bones. She could feel the calm now, the peace that came with knowing she had done something important, something meaningful. As the flight continued, the steady hum of the engines was almost a lullaby. Tanya closed her eyes for a moment, letting her head rest against the window. The peaceful rhythm of the plane, the soft rustling of pages turning, the distant chatter of other passengers. It all felt strangely comforting after the tension of the earlier confrontation. But even as her body relaxed, her mind was busy, reflecting on the past few hours. The exchange with the father still lingered in her thoughts. The sting of his words had cut deeper than she expected, but Marisol's calm intervention, followed by the woman's quiet praise, had settled something inside her. She hadn't been just standing up for her seat. She had been standing up for herself, for her right to exist in that space, to not shrink, to not be made to feel less than. It wasn't a huge victory, not in the way the world often defined victories, but it was her victory, and it felt like the kind that mattered most. The soft ping of the seatbelt sign brought Tanya back to the present. She opened her eyes, glancing around the cabin. The plane was nearing its destination, and she felt a sudden wave of exhaustion flood over her. The kind of tired that wasn't just physical, but emotional too. The kind that came from putting yourself on the line, from having to fight for your space, your peace, your dignity. The flight attendants began making their rounds for the final time, reminding passengers to stow their belongings and prepare for landing. Tanya followed the instructions quietly, but her gaze kept wandering back to the back of the plane, where the father and his daughter were sitting. She saw him glance over at her, his expression still tight, still holding a trace of frustration. But it wasn't the same as before. He wasn't looking at her with contempt or entitlement. There was something else in his eyes now. Maybe a little recognition of the line he had crossed. Maybe a little self-awareness. But most of all, it was a weariness. As if the moment had drained him just as much as it had her. The little girl, who had been quiet throughout the flight, caught Tanya's eye for a brief second. She didn't smile, didn't say anything, but for a moment, their gazes met. There was a silent understanding there, a shared moment between them, one that didn't need words, one that said, "I see you." And that, Tanya realized, was what mattered. The days passed, and life began to return to normal. Tanya was back in her office, buried in paperwork and meetings, the usual buzz of her professional life swallowing up her time. But even as she moved through the motions of the week, something felt different. She was more aware of her space, more protective of her time and her peace. The quiet power of standing her ground had left a lasting imprint on her. It wasn't just the incident with the man on the plane, it was everything that had led to that moment. It was the years of walking through spaces where she often felt unseen, unheard. It was the quiet but constant negotiation for a seat at the table, for a voice that carried weight. And now, every time she found herself in a situation where she could be pushed aside, she didn't let herself bend as easily. At lunch one day, Tanya ran into an old colleague in the building's cafe. As they chatted, he casually made a comment about how the company could use more dynamic leaders. The implication wasn't lost on Tanya. He was, of course, speaking directly to her. She could feel the familiar sting of being underestimated, but this time she didn't flinch. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of amusement in it. "I may not always fit the mold of what you think is dynamic, but trust me, I'm as capable as anyone to lead, and I've earned my seat at the table." Her colleague looked a little taken aback, his smile faltering for just a second. But Tanya didn't back down. She let the words hang in the air, and then, with a cool smile, she turned back to her lunch, refusing to let the subtle put-down land. She had learned that standing her ground didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It didn't need to be a confrontation. It was simply about not letting others define her place in the world. It was about reminding herself, with every step she took, that she had just as much right to be where she was as anyone else. A month later, Tanya found herself at the airport again, this time for a business trip to New York. She'd had a busy week and was already mentally preparing herself for the chaos ahead. As she walked toward the gate, her thoughts drifted back to that flight, to the man, the daughter, the quiet interaction with Marisol, and the woman who had praised her for standing her ground. She smiled to herself, feeling a little lighter. She didn't know if she would ever run into that man again, but it didn't matter. The lesson had already been learned. As she approached her gate, she saw a familiar face. Marisol, the flight attendant who had intervened that day. Tanya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see her again, but there she was, standing at the gate, chatting with a few of the other staff. Marisol saw Tanya at the same time and smiled, that same calm, understanding smile from the plane. "You're on this flight?" Tanya asked, genuinely surprised. Marisol nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Looks like we'll be sharing a ride together again." Tanya smiled back. "I'll be sure to take my seat and hold my ground," she joked. But the words carried more weight than she had intended. Marisol chuckled softly. "That's the spirit. Safe travels, Miss Whitfield. You're always welcome to claim your space."